Wheels up, canopy intact. The fuel selector jammed to the off position as the engine wound down, and then nothing. The Mitsubishi A6M floats in 3 feet of Aleutian muskeg, upside down, its pilot's neck broken on impact. The date is June 4th, 1942. The location is Akutan Island, a volcanic scrap in the Aleutian chain that most Americans couldn't find on a map. The aircraft, serial number 4593, has flown its last combat mission. It doesn't know it yet, but it's about to fly again. For 5 weeks, nobody comes. The Zero sits in the bog while the war moves on. Dutch harbor burns. Midway happens. The Japanese lose 4 carriers in 5 minutes, and through all of it, this single fighter, arguably the most important aircraft of the Pacific War, waits in the mud with its secrets intact. How did American pilots go from losing nearly every engagement with the Zero to systematically dismantling it? Why did Japanese aviators who had dominated the skies over China, over Malaya, over the Philippines, suddenly find themselves on the losing end of fights they should have won? What changed overnight? The answer sat in that bog for 37 days. And when the Americans finally found it, they couldn't believe what they were looking at. A Navy patrol plane spotted the wreck on July 10th. The pilot noted something strange in his report. The aircraft appeared almost undamaged. This was unusual. Japanese pilots were trained to destroy their machines rather than let them fall into enemy hands. The Zero's reputation depended partly on mystery. The Americans knew it could outclimb and outmaneuver anything they had, but they didn't know exactly how, or more importantly, what it couldn't do. The recovery team arrived expecting wreckage. What they found was a gift. If someone in your family flew against the Zero, if they came home with stories about how the tactics changed, how suddenly they knew things they hadn't known before, this is the story behind that shift. Hit subscribe and drop a comment. These details matter. The Zero had landed wheels up in soft ground. The impact had killed Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga instantly, but the airframe had survived almost intact. The propeller was bent. The wingtips had minor damage. The rest of the aircraft, engine, instruments, control surfaces, landing gear, was recoverable. Lieutenant William Thies, the salvage officer, later described the moment they turned it over. It was like finding a complete enemy fighter sitting on a tray waiting for us. The Navy shipped it to North Island, San Diego. By September, engineers had repaired the propeller, patched the skin, and run the Sockeye 14-cylinder radial for the first time on American soil. By October, test pilots were flying it against every American fighter in the inventory: F-4, F Wildcats, P-38 Lightnings, P-39 Airacobras, F-4, U Corsairs, P-51 Mustangs. What they learned rewrote the playbook. The Zero was fast and climbed like nothing else in the sky. At low speed, it could turn inside any American fighter. Japanese pilots had been winning with good reason. In a fair fight, the Zero was superior. But fair fights are for amateurs, and the Zero had weaknesses that its pilots had never had to worry about because nobody had ever survived long enough to exploit them. Above 250 knots, the ailerons stiffened. Roll rate dropped to almost nothing. A hard diving turn to the right, specifically to the right, would leave a Zero pilot wrestling with controls that felt like they'd been set in concrete. The fuel tanks had no self-sealing capability. One tracer round, and the aircraft became a torch. The pilot had no armor, none. The weight savings that made the Zero so agile also made its pilot a target in a way American aviators, sitting behind steel plates, simply weren't. The Americans didn't just learn these weaknesses, they systematized them into doctrine. Commander Shigeru Itaya banks his Zero over the burning wreckage of Wheeler Field and counts the columns of smoke. December 7th, 1941. Below him, American P-40s and P-36s burn in neat rows where they'd been parked, wingtip to wingtip. His pilots haven't lost a single aircraft to enemy action. The Americans never got off the ground. 6 months earlier, the Zero had been a rumor. Chinese pilots reported a new Japanese fighter that could climb faster than anything they'd seen and turned impossibly tight, leaving nothing but burning wreckage behind. The reports filtered back to American intelligence. Nobody believed them. The Zero couldn't be that good. Japanese engineering was supposed to be derivative, copying Western designs with inferior materials. Their pilots were supposed to have poor eyesight. This was an actual belief in American military circles. The idea that Japan had produced the finest carrier fighter in the world simply didn't fit the assumptions. So when Itaya's Zeros swept over Pearl Harbor, American pilots died trying to fight an aircraft they didn't understand. The ones who survived long enough to engage tried to turn with it, get on his tail, stay with him through the turn, line up the shot. Against the Zero, this was suicide. Lieutenant George Welch got airborne from Halewa Field that morning, one of the few American pilots to make it into the sky. He would later describe the experience. They could turn inside us so tight, it was like we were standing still. You'd start a turn, and they'd already be behind you. Welch survived by refusing to play the game. He made slashing attacks from above, fired, and dove away before the Zeros could respond. He shot down 4 aircraft that morning, using tactics that contradicted everything American fighter pilots had been taught. But Welch was improvising. The Navy had no doctrine for fighting an aircraft like this. Clark Field in the Philippines, 10 hours after Pearl Harbor. The story repeated itself. P-40 Warhawks scrambled to intercept the incoming Japanese formation. The Zeros slaughtered them. Pilot after pilot tried to dogfight, tried to use the turning engagement that had worked against every other opponent. Against the Zero, it meant death. The numbers from those first months are brutal. At Wake Island, the defending Marine pilots, flying obsolete F-4, F-3 Wildcats, lost 11 of 12 aircraft in 2 weeks. Over Java, the Dutch and American squadrons opposing the Japanese advance were effectively annihilated. The Zero's kill ratio in early 1942 approached 12-1. Japanese pilots developed a confidence that bordered on contempt. They had trained for years in an aircraft that could outperform anything the Americans or British could field. Their tactics assumed superiority because superiority was real. Saburo Sakai, perhaps the most famous Zero ace, described the early war as almost leisurely. The enemy came up, tried to fight on Japanese terms, and died. The Americans who survived learned the hard way what the test pilots at San Diego would later confirm scientifically. Don't turn with it. Don't climb with it at low speed. Hit and run. Use the one advantage American aircraft had, the ability to dive away faster than the Zero could follow. But these were lessons written in blood, learned by individual pilots through trial and error, passed along in squadron ready rooms when there was time. There was no systematic understanding, no manual, no doctrine that said, here is exactly what the Zero cannot do, and here is how you kill it. The Japanese had no reason to suspect this would change. Superior fighter, better trained pilots. The war was 6 months old, and the Zero had never been captured intact. The calculus shifted on a volcanic island in the Aleutians, where a dead pilot's aircraft sat waiting in the mud. We couldn't fight them the way we'd been taught to fight. Commander John Thatch said it plainly, without drama, in a debrief after Midway. The man who would give his name to the most important fighter tactic of the Pacific War sat in a ready room and admitted that everything he'd learned about aerial combat was wrong, at least against this enemy. Thatch had been thinking about the Zero problem since February, when intelligence reports from the Dutch East Indies filtered back to his squadron aboard the Saratoga. The reports were grim. American and Allied pilots were dying at rates that suggested something fundamentally broken in how they approached air combat. The Zero wasn't just better. It was operating in a different category, and the standard response, pursue, close, maneuver for position, amounted to a death sentence. The Navy had no captured Zero to study, no wind tunnel data, no performance charts. Thatch had rumors, combat reports from pilots who'd survived long enough to file them, and the growing certainty that continuing to fight the old way meant continuing to lose. So he did something unusual for a combat aviator. He went back to first principles, matchsticks on a table, hours in his stateroom, moving the little wooden shapes around, trying to find a geometry that worked. The Zero could outturn any American fighter. That much was established fact. A pilot who tried to follow it through a turning engagement would find himself always behind, never able to close to firing range, exposed to the Zero's guns the whole time. What if you stopped trying to win the turn? The insight was counterintuitive. Fighter pilots are trained to get on the enemy's tail and stay there. Thatch proposed something different. 2 aircraft flying in loose formation, each responsible for protecting the other's tail. When a Zero committed to attacking one Wildcat, the pilot would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would turn toward him. The Zero, following the first aircraft through its turn, would fly directly into the guns of the second. The geometry was elegant. The tactic required trust. You had to believe your wingman would be where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to do, at the exact moment it mattered. Thatch drilled his pilots until the weave became instinct. By the time Yorktown steamed toward Midway in June 1942, VF-3 could execute it without thinking. June 4th. The same day, Petty Officer Koga's Zero went into the Aleutian mud. Thatch's Wildcats engaged Japanese fighters over the Midway Task Force, 6 F-4Fs against a swarm that outnumbered them badly. The Zeros came in, expecting the usual result. They found something else. Thatch later estimated his small force destroyed between 10 and 12 enemy aircraft while losing only 1 of their own. The math had flipped. Wildcats that should have died were surviving, killing and surviving again. The weave worked. Thatch didn't know why. He understood that his tactic negated the Zero's turning advantage by refusing to engage in a turning fight. He understood the geometry of mutual protection. What he didn't know was the specific aerodynamic reason the Zero could turn the way it did, or the specific weaknesses that made it vulnerable. The Thatch weave was a survival mechanism, not an exploitation of enemy design flaws. Thatch had found a way to stop losing. The captured Zero would show American pilots how to start winning on their own terms, how to hunt instead of merely survive. The Imperial Japanese Navy noticed something had changed over Midway. Their pilots reported that American tactics seemed different, more coordinated, harder to counter. But they attributed the losses to chaos, bad luck, the Americans finally learning basic fighter discipline. They had no way of knowing that two separate events, one tactical, one intelligence, were about to converge into something catastrophic for their air forces. 18 Zeros launched from the carrier Ryujo on the morning of June 4th. 17 returned. The arithmetic seems unremarkable. One aircraft lost to enemy action during a strike on Dutch Harbor, Alaska. American anti-aircraft gunners claimed it. The Japanese marked Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga as killed in action and moved on. War generates these statistics by the thousand, but Koga wasn't dead yet. He was alive when his Zero took the hit, alive as oil streamed across his windscreen and the Sakai engine started running rough, its temperature climbing past the red line. He was 26 miles from his carrier when the ground fire found him. The shell, probably a .50 caliber round from one of the Army positions defending Dutch Harbor, punctured his oil line. A Zero could fly without a lot of things. It could not fly without oil pressure. Koga had minutes, maybe less, before the engine seized. The smell would have hit him first. Hot oil burning off the cowling. That particular acrid sweetness that pilots learn to recognize as the prelude to catastrophic engine failure. Koga's wingmen, Petty Officers Tsuguo Shikada and Tsuguya Oda, watched him signal that he was going down. They couldn't help. A Zero carried no rescue equipment, no survival gear worth mentioning. If Koga went into the North Pacific, he would die of hypothermia in minutes. He turned toward land. Akutan Island appeared through the oil-smeared canopy as a mass of green and brown, volcanic, treeless in places. And there, what looked like a flat meadow, smooth enough to set down on. Koga made his decision. He would land wheels down, preserve the aircraft, wait for rescue. His wingmen would mark the position. A submarine or float plane would retrieve him. This was the plan. It assumed the meadow was solid ground. Shikada and Oda circled overhead as Koga lined up his approach. His airspeed dropped, flaps down. The Zero descended toward what appeared to be a perfect emergency landing site. From altitude, the tundra looked like grass. It was not grass. It was muskeg, a waterlogged bog covered by a thin layer of vegetation, soft enough to swallow a man to his waist. An aircraft landing on it would not roll to a stop. It would dig in and flip. The wheels touched. Koga felt the drag immediately. Wrong. Too much resistance. The ground pulling at his aircraft instead of supporting it. The Zero's nose pitched forward as the landing gear buried itself. The tail came up. Koga was inverted before he could react. The aircraft hit the bog upside down at approximately 90 miles per hour. The impact broke Koga's neck. He died still strapped into his cockpit, hanging inverted, his hands probably still on the controls. Shikada and Oda saw the crash. They circled once, confirmed no movement, and returned to Ryujo with the coordinates. Standard procedure called for destruction of downed aircraft to prevent capture. They strafed the wreck, or tried to. Their reports later claimed they had riddled it with gunfire. The after-action report from Ryujo recorded, Aircraft number 4593, lost due to enemy fire, pilot killed. Wreckage destroyed by accompanying aircraft. None of it was true except Koga's death. The Zero sat in 3 feet of bog water, cushioned by muskeg, its vital systems intact. The strafing runs had missed or failed to penetrate. Fog was rolling in, visibility deteriorating, and shooting at a dark shape in dark water from a moving aircraft is harder than it sounds. The airframe that should have been scattered wreckage was merely muddy, inverted, waiting. 5 weeks of Aleutian weather, fog and rain, the constant wind that scours those islands, passed over Koga's tomb. The war moved south without him. July 10th, 1942. A Navy PBY Catalina on routine patrol over Akutan Island. The crew isn't looking for a downed Japanese fighter. They're watching for submarines, scanning the gray water that separates Alaska from the Aleutian chain. The fog lifts for maybe 20 minutes that morning, a window that opens and closes without warning in that part of the world. The navigator spots it first, a shape in the tundra that doesn't belong, dark against the green, angular where everything else is curved. He calls the pilot over. They drop lower. The Catalina circles twice. The shape resolves into an aircraft, inverted, its landing gear pointing at the sky. The red circles on the wings are unmistakable even through the mist. A Zero, intact enough to matter. The discovery was pure accident. The patrol route that day wasn't supposed to pass over Akutan's interior. Weather had pushed them inland. The fog clearing at the exact moment they flew overhead. That was luck of a kind that defies probability. 1 hour earlier, 1 hour later, and the aircraft stays hidden. The Japanese after-action report claiming the wreck destroyed would have remained the final word. The Americans didn't even know a Zero had gone down in the Aleutians. No intelligence report. No search directive. The Navy wasn't looking for Koga's aircraft because the Navy didn't know it existed. American intelligence called the aircraft Zeke, not Zero. The Allied codename system assigned male names to fighters, female names to bombers, a convention that would persist through the war. Zero was the Japanese designation, short for Type 0 carrier fighter, named for the imperial year 2600, 1940 by the Western calendar, when it entered service. American pilots kept calling it the Zero anyway. The official designation never stuck in the squadrons that actually fought against it. Some names resist bureaucracy. Back to Akutan. The recovery team arrived 5 days later. Lieutenant William Thies led the salvage party, a small group of sailors who had to figure out how to extract a 3,000-pound aircraft from a bog without heavy equipment. The logistics were absurd. Akutan had no port facilities, no roads, no infrastructure of any kind. The nearest American base was Dutch Harbor, and nearest meant a journey by small boat through waters that could kill you faster than any enemy. They found Koga still in the cockpit. His body had been there for 5 weeks. The smell would have been significant. The sailors removed him with whatever dignity the circumstances allowed. Sources don't record the details, and probably that's appropriate. The Zero itself was in remarkable condition. The inverted landing had crumpled the vertical stabilizer and bent the propeller, but the fuselage was sound. The engine hadn't seized before impact. The control surfaces moved freely. The cockpit instruments were readable. Most critically, the wing structure, the secret to the Zero's turning ability, was undamaged. Getting it out required improvisation. The team used hand tools and wooden planks to lever the aircraft upright, then dragged it across the tundra to a beach where a barge could reach it. The work took days. Aleutian summer is cold, wet, and miserable even in July. By late July, the Zero was aboard a transport ship bound for Seattle. From Seattle, it traveled by rail to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. By all logic, the aircraft should have been destroyed, strafed into wreckage, lost under 5 weeks of fog. Instead, it rolled into an American hangar on a flatbed car. The test pilots were waiting. The Zero was everything the rumors claimed, and nothing the rumors prepared them for. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders taxied Koga's aircraft onto the North Island runway in late September 1942. The sockeye engine rebuilt, with parts fabricated by American machinists who had never seen a Japanese radial before. The smell of fresh paint mixed with aviation fuel. The Navy had repainted the aircraft in American colors, added false markings, done everything possible to prevent some trigger-happy gunner from shooting down their prize. Sanders opened the throttle. The Zero leaped off the runway like something startled. The climb rate was real. The turning radius was real. Everything the combat reports had claimed, verified in the first 5 minutes of flight. Sanders pulled the aircraft through maneuvers that would have stalled an F-4F, and the Zero just kept turning. The controls light and responsive, the airframe seemingly unbothered by physics. He understood immediately why American pilots had been dying. This aircraft forgave mistakes and invited aggression. It made its pilot feel invincible. Then Sanders pushed the nose down. Negative G flight, the kind of pushover maneuver a pilot uses to escape an attacker coming from above. The carburetor coughed. The engine stumbled. For a long second, the sockeye went silent as fuel stopped flowing to the cylinders. Sanders felt his stomach rise toward his throat as the aircraft fell, powerless, until positive G restored fuel flow and the engine caught again. American carburetors had fuel injection. They fed regardless of aircraft attitude. The Zero's float-type carburetor relied on gravity. Push the nose down hard enough, and the engine quit. Every American fighter in the Pacific could escape a Zero by diving and pushing over into negative G. The Japanese aircraft couldn't follow. The test program ran for weeks. Sanders and other pilots flew the Zero against everything in the American inventory. F-4, F Wildcat, P-38 Lightning, P-39 Airacobra, P-51 Mustang, the new F-4 U Corsair. They documented each engagement, analyzed each maneuver, cataloged every weakness they found. Above 300 miles per hour, the ailerons stiffened. Roll rate dropped. The same aircraft that could outturn anything at low speed became sluggish and predictable at high speed. An American pilot who dove away and built up velocity could roll out of a Zero's gun sight faster than the Japanese pilot could follow. The fuel tanks didn't self-seal. A single incendiary round into the wing root would ignite the fuel and keep burning. American aircraft had rubber-lined tanks that closed around bullet holes, heavier but survivable. The Zero traded that survivability for range and climb performance. No armor behind the pilot. The seat was aluminum and fabric. An American fighter attacking from behind could kill the pilot without ever touching a critical system. The weight savings that made the Zero light enough to turn also made it a coffin the moment bullets arrived from the wrong angle. Each discovery was another pilot who didn't have to die. The carburetor cutout meant dive and push over. The aileron stiffening. Stay fast, fight fast, never slow down. And the lack of armor meant one good burst from behind could end the engagement permanently. The test reports went straight to the fleet. Fighter squadrons received briefings on exactly how to kill the aircraft that had been killing them. The information cost nothing except fuel, flight hours, and one Japanese pilot dead in an Aleutian bog. Koga never knew. He died trying to preserve his aircraft for recovery by his own side. Instead, he preserved it for the enemy. The decision to land wheels down, the pilot's instinct to save his machine, delivered the Zero intact to the people who most needed to understand it. The Japanese pilot who crash-landed on Akutan Island made one final contribution to the war. It just wasn't for Japan. November 1942. Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, Texas. A classroom full of replacement pilots. 18 months ago, most of them were college students or farm kids or shop clerks. Now they sit in wooden chairs bolted to the floor, watching an instructor tap a chalkboard diagram of an aircraft they've never seen in person. The Zero, or rather, the Zero's vulnerabilities, numbered 1 through 7. The mimeographed handouts smell like fresh ink and machine oil. Each pilot gets a copy. The document is classified confidential, which means don't leave it in a bar, but the information inside will be common knowledge in every ready room from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal within weeks. The Navy wants it spread. They want every pilot who climbs into an F-4F or F-4U to know exactly what they're facing and exactly how to survive it. Item 1. The carburetor. The Zero uses a float-type carburetor that will cut out under negative G loading. A pushover from level flight or a dive will cause momentary engine failure. Exploit this by initiating negative G maneuvers when pursued. The pilots write it down. Some of them underline it twice. Item 2. High-speed handling. Above 275 knots indicated airspeed. The Zero's ailerons become increasingly heavy. Roll rate degrades significantly. American fighters retain superior roll characteristics at high speed. Engage only at speeds exceeding 300 knots when possible. Item 3. Structural limitations. Do not attempt to follow the Zero in tight horizontal turns. The aircraft can sustain G-loads that will cause American fighters to stall. Instead, use vertical maneuvers and speed to disengage and re-engage from advantage. The instructor pauses here. He's flown combat. He knows what these words mean, translated into burning aircraft and dying men. Gentlemen, he says, this is the first time in this war we've been able to tell you exactly how to fight this airplane. The information comes from a captured aircraft currently undergoing flight testing. What I'm giving you today isn't theory. It's verified fact. The pilots who tested this machine nearly died figuring out what I'm about to teach you for free. The Tactical Intelligence Bulletin that went to fleet squadrons in late 1942 contained a passage that would be quoted in pilot memoirs for decades. Never attempt to dogfight the Zero. The aircraft will outturn any American fighter at low to moderate speeds. Survival depends on maintaining energy advantage. Dive to gain speed. Roll to break the enemy's tracking solution. Extend and re-engage only from a position of advantage. The Zero cannot follow a high-speed diving attack. It cannot match American roll rates above 300 miles per hour. These limitations are absolute. The word absolute carried weight. It meant the Navy was certain. It meant somebody had done the work. By January 1943, the doctrine had a name. Pilots called it boom and zoom, dive from above, fire, climb away, repeat, never slow down to turn, never accept a circling fight. The Zero's strengths became irrelevant if the American pilot refused to let the engagement happen on Japanese terms. The replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific in early 1943 knew things their predecessors had died learning. The engine quit under -G. The ailerons froze at high speed. One good burst into an unarmored cockpit ended the fight. They knew all of it, because the Navy had flown the enemy's own aircraft and written the answers down in language clear enough for a 20-year-old who'd never seen combat to understand. Doctrine written in an enemy's handwriting, paid for by a Japanese pilot who tried to save his aircraft and instead gave it away. The kill ratios began shifting that winter. Not dramatically at first. War doesn't work that way. But the bleeding slowed. American pilots started coming back from engagements they would have lost 6 months earlier. The Japanese noticed. They couldn't understand it. Lieutenant Tetsuzo Iwamoto pulls his Zero into a climbing turn over the Russell Islands, February 1943, and the Grumman that should be following him isn't there. He cranes his neck, searching the sky behind and below, and finds the American 3,000 feet down and accelerating away, a blue shape against blue water, trailing a thin ribbon of exhaust smoke. The American isn't running. He's repositioning. Iwamoto has seen this maneuver before, but only from experienced pilots, men with hundreds of hours in theater. This American flies like a replacement. The aircraft markings are fresh. The flying itself is textbook, too textbook, the kind of precise geometry they teach in training schools. And yet the maneuver is exactly right. The American is building speed, trading altitude for energy, setting up for another pass from above. 6 months ago, that pilot would have followed Iwamoto into the turn and died there. Now he refuses the invitation entirely. The smell of cordite hangs in Iwamoto's cockpit from the burst he fired moments earlier. A miss, the tracers arcing behind the Grumman's tail as the American rolled away at precisely the wrong moment. The controls feel light in his hands, the Zero responsive and eager, but responsiveness means nothing if the enemy won't stay in his gun sights long enough to kill. Iwamoto has 400 combat hours. He flew at Pearl Harbor, at Rabaul, at Guadalcanal. He has killed Americans in F-4Fs and P-40s and P-39s, and he knows what dying pilots do. They panic, they turn, they try to outmaneuver an aircraft that cannot be outmaneuvered. These new Americans don't panic. They dive, they roll, they extend and climb and come back with the sun behind them and their guns already firing. They fight like men who have read a manual on exactly how to kill him. The Japanese after-action reports from early 1943 carry a tone of baffled frustration that wasn't present 6 months earlier. Enemy pilots demonstrated unusual tactical discipline, one squadron commander wrote after a fighter sweep over Guadalcanal. They refused to engage in turning combat and employed coordinated diving attacks from altitude. Losses among our experienced pilots have increased, despite numerical superiority in several engagements. The report offers no explanation for the change. It can't. The author doesn't know about the aircraft sitting in a hangar in San Diego, doesn't know about the test flights, doesn't know that the enemy has been studying his machine with instruments and stopwatches and the methodical patience of engineers solving a problem. He only knows that Americans who should be easy kills are suddenly dangerous, and Americans who should be dangerous are suddenly lethal. The mathematics of air combat over the Solomons has shifted, and nobody on the Japanese side can identify the variable that changed. By March 1943, the kill ratios had inverted in certain squadrons. American units flying the new F-4U Corsair, faster than the Zero, heavier, with 650 caliber guns that could saw a wing off at 400 yards, began posting exchange rates that would have been impossible 12 months earlier. The Corsair pilots knew what to do. Dive. Roll right, not left, because the Zero's torque made right rolls harder to counter. Aim for the wing roots where the fuel sat waiting to burn. Somebody had written it down in language clear enough to memorize, and they had memorized it before they ever saw combat. The veterans of Guadalcanal had learned these lessons through blood. The replacements arrived already knowing them. The difference was invisible from a Japanese cockpit. Green pilots flying like men who had already fought the Zero and survived. In a sense, they had. They'd fought it in classrooms in Corpus Christi, in briefing rooms in Hawaii, in ready rooms aboard carriers, fought it in their heads until the moves became instinct. The smell of burning oil and scorched aluminum. Rabaul, April 1943. A Zero lands with holes stitched across the left wing, fuel streaming from a punctured tank that somehow didn't ignite. The pilot climbs out shaking, his flight suit dark with sweat despite the altitude cold still clinging to his skin. He's the only one from his section who made it back. 3 aircraft lost to a flight of Corsairs that dove out of the sun, fired, and vanished before anyone could turn to engage. The deck crews watch him walk toward the operations shack. Nobody asks what happened. They already know. This has been happening for months. The theories multiplied. Japanese intelligence officers studied the new American aircraft, the F-4U with its inverted gull wings, the P-38 with its twin engines and twin booms, and concluded that superior machines explain the shift. The Americans had finally built fighters that could match the Zero. This was partially true. The Corsair was faster, climbed nearly as well, and carried enough firepower to destroy a Zero with a 2-second burst. But speed and firepower didn't explain the tactics. The new American aircraft could have been flown the old way, slow, turning, dying in horizontal fights, and the results would have been the same disaster as 1942. The machines were better, but the doctrine had changed more than the hardware. Some Japanese pilots blamed their own replacements. The men arriving from flight schools in 1943 had fewer training hours than the men they replaced. Fuel shortages, instructor losses, the constant hemorrhage of experienced pilots. The training pipeline was producing aviators who could fly but couldn't fight. This was also true, and it mattered. But it didn't explain why American replacements, equally green, were suddenly performing like veterans. The Japanese training system was degrading while the American system improved. The gap widened in both directions simultaneously. A few veterans sensed something deeper. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, noticed the pattern in early 1943. Americans who should have been easy kills were executing maneuvers that precisely countered the Zero's strengths. They dove when they should have turned, rolled when they should have pulled. They refused engagements that would have been victories 6 months earlier. Sakai couldn't name the source, but he recognized what he was seeing. coordinated, systematic knowledge being applied by pilots who had never faced a Zero before. Someone had taught them. Someone had given them answers that Japanese pilots had spent years developing and protecting. The Imperial Japanese Navy never recovered Koga's aircraft. They searched Akutan Island in the weeks after the Dutch harbor raid, found nothing, assumed the Zero had sunk in the bog or been destroyed beyond recognition. The war moved south. The Aleutians became a sideshow, and Petty Officer Koga's crash landing disappeared into the administrative silence of a military bureaucracy fighting on too many fronts to track every loss. No one connected the missing aircraft to the change in American tactics. No one imagined that their enemy had flown their own fighter, cataloged its weaknesses, and distributed the results to every pilot in the Pacific. They learned the truth after the war. Former Japanese officers reading American intelligence reports, interviewing former enemies, piecing together the timeline of their own defeat. The Akutan Zero, the test flights at North Island, the tactical bulletins that went to every squadron, the doctrine that emerged from flying their own aircraft against their own tactics. The answer had been sitting in American hangars and ready rooms since late 1942, and Japan's pilots had spent the rest of the war fighting an enemy who knew exactly how to kill them. The source of their confusion was also the source of their losses. They couldn't diagnose the problem because the problem was invisible. A crashed aircraft and a dead pilot on a remote island. An enemy who found what Japan had lost and used it to rewrite the mathematics of Pacific air combat. What actually beat the Zero? The easy answer is the F-6F Hellcat. Grumman's new fighter entered service in late 1943 and proceeded to slaughter Japanese aviation with an efficiency that bordered on industrial. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero, climbed better, dove better, absorbed punishment that would have shredded Mitsubishi's lightweight design. By 1944, Hellcat pilots were posting kill ratios of 19-1. The aircraft seemed purpose-built to destroy Zeros, and aviation historians have spent decades crediting the Akutan capture with its design. They're wrong. The timeline doesn't support it. Grumman began designing the XF-6F in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, 15 months before Koga's crash landing. The Navy had already specified what they wanted: more speed, more armor, more firepower, more range. The basic shape of the Hellcat was locked before Americans knew the Zero existed. The prototype flew in June 1942, the same month Koga died on Akutan Island. The production contract was signed in October, weeks before the first test flights of the captured aircraft at North Island. The Hellcat wasn't designed around intelligence from Koga's Zero. It was designed around the Navy's best guess about what a Pacific fighter needed to do. The Akutan aircraft did contribute minor refinements. The Hellcat's designers studied the test data and made small adjustments to the production model. But these were tweaks, not transformations. The fundamental aircraft that would sweep Japanese fighters from the Pacific sky was already built before Americans flew Koga's machine. So what did the captured Zero actually accomplish? It accomplished the pilots. The Hellcat could have been flown badly. It could have been flown the way F-4Fs were flown in the first 6 months of the war, turning, bleeding speed, playing to Japanese strengths. A bad pilot in a Hellcat was still a dead pilot. The aircraft's advantages only mattered if the man in the cockpit knew how to use them. and the men who climbed into Hellcats in 1943 knew exactly how to use them, because the Navy had written doctrine based on flying the enemy's own aircraft. Dive, roll right, never turn, aim for the wing roots. The Hellcat gave American pilots the tools to execute that doctrine. The Akutan Zero gave them the doctrine itself. The Japanese never understood this. They watched their kill ratios collapse and blamed American machines. They studied photographs of Hellcats and Corsairs and concluded that industrial superiority explained their losses. In one sense, they were correct. American factories outproduced Japanese factories by margins that made the air war a simple question of replacement rates. But production doesn't explain why green American pilots fought like veterans, or why men with 50 hours of combat time executed maneuvers that should have required 500. The answer was sitting in ready rooms across the Pacific, mimeographed and classified confidential, written in language simple enough for a 20-year-old to memorize before his first mission. Intelligence won the air war. Not better aircraft, not more aircraft. Knowledge, systematized, distributed, drilled into every replacement pilot before he ever saw a Zero. The Akutan capture didn't change American fighters. It changed American fighter pilots. It turned institutional ignorance into institutional knowledge in 6 months. And Japanese aviators spent the next 3 years dying against an enemy who had already fought them in classrooms and won. August 1945. A Navy intelligence officer at Atsugi Airfield sorts through captured Japanese documents, looking for technical data on aircraft production. He finds a folder dated April 1943, after-action reports from Rabaul, complaints about American tactical changes, requests for guidance that were never answered. He flags it for translation and moves to the next box.